Good afternoon again. The final item I have for you, Madam Chair, members of the board, and Superintendent Davis is for the budget cycle and calendar for FY23. And as we are nearing the end of the fiscal year, it's time to set our sights on budgeting. Based on board queries and comments from last month, I have included process reminders for review before we discuss the FY23 budget calendar, and we will start with a quick review of funds and fund accounting. In accordance with state law, school system financials are governed by governmental accounting standards. These standards organize accounting on a fund basis, which allows for the specific tracking of sources, or revenue, and our expenses, or our expenditures, which are considered uses of income for specific purposes. Per governmental accounting standards, we create funds for unique programs for which funding has been identified. Funds that have similar purposes can be aggregated to a summary fund level. Annually, we present the superintendent's recommended budget across 4 aggregate funds in accordance with board policy DC. The first of the 4 funds is the general fund, which is the account used for our daily operations like salaries, instructional supplies, and maintenance costs, etc. Next is the special revenue fund. This fund accounts for grants given to Henry County Schools for designated purposes, and we also account for the financials associated with our nutrition program and our after-school enrichment program, which are considered enterprising activities. Next is the Capital Projects Fund, which allows for separate tracking of the revenues and expenditures related to the capital improvements authorized by this board. And finally, there's the Debt Service Fund, which captures revenue and expenses associated with long-term debt incurred to finance those capital projects. There are a myriad of external and internal inputs that must be considered in developing a budget for each of those funds. The timing of when key information is available drives the timeline that you see presented in the budget calendar. Before I present the budget calendar, I would like to first walk through a visual that outlines the sequence of events that supports budget development. The specifics of budget development processes for each of the funds will vary. I am going to focus on the general fund as I walk through this visual outline because it has a variety of inputs, and I think it'll be a helpful use case. So the general fund receives state, local, and federal funds, but the state and local funding account for 99.5% of our general fund revenues, which are allocated to those general fund purposes. Accordingly, the external activity, such as the governor's budget recommendations, the state budget process, and Henry County's tax assessor processes, have a significant impact on our system's budget planning. We carefully monitor the news coming from the governor's office and the Gold Dome from January to April to identify and analyze the legislative activity and its impact on school system financials and our budget development process. To forecast the local revenues, we partner with the tax assessor's office to understand changes that are occurring in the local tax digest. And this information begins to emerge in March and is continually refined until the assessor appeals process ends. As the General Assembly and local tax officials complete work that informs revenue forecasting and provides intel on potential new costs associated with legislation, the superintendent directs a series of internal tasks to develop allocation recommendations that support student learning at the highest levels. As you may recall from our time together last year, there are multiple opportunities for board members to share budgetary priorities that inform the superintendent's budget recommendations. Board, we know that you take responsibility to effect change through fiscal allocations seriously. The work of the board and the prior boards has resulted in intentional investments in salaries, instructional resources and supports, and safe and secure learning environments. We know that this board remains committed to ensuring competitive salaries to ensure and support the recruitment and retention of highly effective teachers and leaders. And this year, we anticipate the availability of information from compensation and class studies to inform personnel investments for FY23 and beyond. Other key inputs into the budget development process include enrollment projections, school and division assessments, and strategic investment priorities. With the launch of our 5-year community-inspired plan, we have a powerful resource that embodies the hopes, dreams, and voices of our community that will serve as a critical input into the FY23 budget cycle and future budget cycles. The leadership team is actively engaged in deep review of the strategic action plan to identify the personnel, instructional, and operational investments that are required to accomplish the goals our community and this board have outlined. So I'm going to pause before I move from this slide because I do want to orient you to this visual because I believe it really speaks to the sequencing of events and how the information becomes available for us to then share. So the legislature will convene in January. In fact, the date this year is January the 11th. And within 5 days of them convening, the governor is required to give them a budget. The House will have a view of the budget. The Senate will have a view of the budget, similar to what you see in the national politics. And if they don't have the same budget, which typically they do not, there's a conference where they work through to get to a common recommendation in appropriations. The appropriations budget, which you'll see, is somewhere usually in the April where the legislative cycle is beginning to end, will go then to the governor, who will then execute that budget and approve it. So it's in April where things really begin to finalize. But as you know, we're constantly meeting with you all, hearing from you all. This year we'll be able to look at our strategic plan. There's a number of other inputs. We have enrollment projections. We have our staff allotments. We have the school needs assessments. And again, there's going to be the new compensation and class studies as information will be available this year. With 99.5% of our budget being tied to that state and local input, you'll see that the picture begins to crystallize around April, which is when we begin to put information in front of you and to the public. The superintendent is required to present a balanced budget each year, and so you'll see that the external activity which sets the parameters is then what allows us to then construct the expenditures. So I hope this visual demonstrates that there are a lot of processes and inputs that must be considered during the budget development process. And so with an understanding of those key inputs and timing, I will now present the FY23 budget development calendar, and this document will be available in the board meeting attachments. As I shared earlier, the state legislative session will run January to early April. I will provide reports in February and March to update the board on the economic outlook and budget forecasting impacts from information that's coming from the General Assembly. On April 18th, I will present the tentative budget, and we will hold our first of 2 required budget hearings. Following the hearing, the board will be presented with the opportunity to adopt a tentative budget. I will follow back in May 9th to present the second presentation of a budget recommendation, and we will have our second budget hearing following that, and the board will have the opportunity to adopt the final proposed budget. I'll conclude my report highlighting the foundational work this board has done to ensure we have a clear compass that guides the prioritization of resources. Your commitment to defining the unified governance model and allocating funding accordingly is a key lever to ensuring your vision that every student in Henry County Schools receives a high-quality, world-class education, and that manifests from the boardroom to the classroom. Dr. Davis, that concludes what I've prepared, and I turn it back over to you.